welcome to the Learn Arena podcast. I am Trey Goff. With me is Gabriel Mitchell. He and I work together on a project called Learn Arena. And today's episode, we are going to start a new episode format. Our previous episodes, which will continue, are intellectual overviews of specific kind of subject areas that we currently have courses on Learn Arena. Those episodes are to help you learn about academic topics. These episodes will be totally different. These are still geared toward helping you learn about the world as it is today, with a major difference. We will use current events, whether that be research findings, research papers, blog posts, articles, Substack articles, whatever, as jumping off points for what hopefully for you, the audience, is an informative intellectual discussion of something that we all care about, some kind of hot button, current topical issue that is kind of in the intellectual zeitgeist and people are talking about right now. So with that kind of format note out of the way, and to be clear, we will continue doing the course-specific subject area episodes as well. We're just going to throw these in weekly too. So with that out of the way, let's dive in. What we are discussing today is a pair of articles. One of them is a website. The website is WTFHappenedin1971.com. And the second one is a kind of response to or extension of that website, a blog post by the great Eric Hole called What the Heck Happened in 2012. The thesis of both of these, right, is that there was some weird discontinuity, first in 1971 and then in 2012, that radically changed the American economy and American culture. Now, the What Happened in 1971 website, which is the first one I'll overview, describes an economic shift. And the website is literally just a bunch of graphs. And it shows that there was a huge discontinuity that happened in the American economy in 1971. Let me describe some of these things, and hopefully we'll be able to show them on screen for you as I walk you through them. So first, growth in productivity prior to 1971 was perfectly tied to growth in hourly compensation. So as the total macroeconomic activity grew, so too did hourly wages. Then suddenly, in 1971, those two divorced, and hourly wages adjusted for inflation have been slightly flat to a little bit up since 1971, while overall economic activity, productivity, is up 246%. So those two completely divorced in 1971, which obviously you can see would cause a bunch of kind of cultural and political problems immediately, as hourly wages are lagging far behind overall economic progress for some reason. We also see a similar shift in 1971. So there are a couple of things that used to be very tightly correlated. They moved almost as one. Real GDP per capita, real GDP per full-time employee, average real wage just meaning inflation adjusted by a GDP deflator, average real wage according to the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, and real, meaning inflation adjusted, median weekly earnings of full-time workers, right? So all five of those things used to move in unison. They no longer do. In 1971, very abruptly, they all divorced. And real median weekly earnings of full-time workers is completely flat since 1971, while real GDP per capita has almost 3x since 1971. We also see that the gains to top earners drastically increased. So in 1971, the 95th percentile of earners was earning roughly had their income growing at roughly the same rate as the median in the bottom 20th percentile. That has since divorced. Now top earners are earning more faster than any other income group. The income growth of the bottom 90% of earners was a hockey stick up and to the right. It was growing rapidly up until 1971, at which point it completely stalled. And also in 1971, again, the top 1% of earners' income drastically started increasing, and has experienced much higher income growth than the bottom 90% of earners. There's been a 50-year decline in wages since 1971, in real wages. Income concentration sharply started rising in 1971, meaning the income started going more to the top 1%. And this kind of continues for a while. It even splits along ethnic backgrounds, right? So the average black income as a percentage of average white income was increasing drastically. Black income had gone from 50% of white income in 1948 all the way up to almost 70% of white income by 1971. That progress has since stalled and is stuck at 75%. There's a bunch of other statistics that kind of became divorced. America became a nation of dual income working couples. That was very sudden, started in 1971. income inequality drastically increased, inflation drastically increased. So one of the most powerful charts in here is the unit price per can of Campbell's condensed tomato soup. Starting the data for this, luckily, because Campbell's keeps good records, goes all the way back to 1898. That price, adjusted for inflation, was almost perfectly flat until 1971, at which point it hockey sticked up and to the right. Electricity prices started increasing. Home prices drastically started increasing in 1971 in superstar cities, as they're called. The monetary inflation increases. Currency devaluation increased drastically. The federal debt started increasing drastically. National debt as a percentage of GDP increased drastically. There's a bunch of stuff that kind of broke here. Personal savings rate went down drastically. So I'll kind of stop there because there's more charts that keep reiterating this same thing over and over again. Another very important one I will mention, or another two I will mention, is that world per capita energy consumption was drastically increasing and then totally plateaued in 1971. Ideological polarization drastically increased in 1971. We see a bunch of stuff that broke. Basically, economics and politics more or less broke in 1971. And it is kind of unclear why. And once you see this website, and I would encourage you to go look for yourself, and we'll show some of these charts on screen as we're talking, drastically just fell off of the previous correlations they had. It used to be the case, in a nutshell, right, that the productivity of the economy was directly correlated with, at almost perfectly one-to-one, the income of your average American. And fundamentally, that broke. Top earners started earning much more as a percentage of overall income, and the median Americans' wages fell flat all of a sudden in 1971. And it had all of these kind of political downstream effects that I think we're still seeing today. I would even go so far as to argue Donald Trump got elected in part because of this discontinuity. Now, Eric Hull did a continuation of this last week called What the Heck Happened in 2012, and his argument is cultural. So his argument is that 2012 was a cultural tipping point, right? So the first thing we kind of see here is mental health related issues. Depressive symptoms in U.S. 8th, 10th, and 12th graders used to be very flat, right around between 20 and 30%, depending on what metric you look at. Those started hockey sticking up and are now almost 50%, starting directly in 2012. Teenage self-harm episodes drastically increased in 2012 after having been flat for decades. Mental health for women in particular fell off a cliff in 1971 after having been flat for decades. Overall reading and mathematics scores for students were slightly increasing slowly over time since the 1970s, fell off of a cliff and drastically decreased for the first time in 2012. The U.S. birth rate, after having been fairly constant for decades, fell off a cliff in 2012. Importantly, Tinder was released in 2012. And then other cultural things that are just hard to explain, like explicit lyrics in Billboard Hot 100 singles drastically increased in 2012. In 2012 was the time where we saw the sudden explosion of sequels and remakes. That started in 2012 in terms of movies. 2012 was the year the kind of woke revolution started. So there's some great graphs in here about the use of kind of what we would consider woke terminology like sexism, homophobia, racism, etc. Those were all constant and flat up to 2012, after which they hockey sticked up and to the right. Political polarization split by gender drastically starting in 2012 to the point now where every single demographic group except single women votes majority Republican, but single women vote Democrat by a 37% margin, right? Perceptions of sexism and racism in the workplace drastically increased in 2012. Smartphones suddenly became prevalent in 2012, which is probably a part of this picture. And unemployment drastically increased starting in 2012. So some of these are still economic, but a lot of them are cultural. So I want to open to you, Gabriel, now that I have overviewed this. To summarize, the economy broke in 1971, where earnings totally divorced from productivity, and the rich got a lot richer a lot faster. And culture totally broke in 2012. We stopped being able to make original movies. The woke revolution kind of hit right around that time. Mental health for youth and women especially, but men as well, fell off a cliff in 2012. So what do we think happened? Why are there these sharp discontinuities in those 2 years? And Gabriel, what do you think happened first in 1971 and then in 2012, first to break the economy and then to break our culture?
Yeah, so the popular kind of libertarian interpretation of this 1971 thing was that would have been, if correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I believe that would have been the year that Nixon removed the gold standard, or at least started taking steps to do so. And so the one possible interpretation here is that now that we no longer have sound money, now that we no longer have stable currency and stable inflation, that we have more inflation, we're going to have problems with central banking, that are going to lead to other economic issues. And it kind of does logically follow, like inflation means that you're spending more. Inflation increases in inflation means lower standard of living. And it follows logically that by removing the gold standard, you have increased inflation. And so I think that's the most common interpretation of this. However, something that I have noticed in my digging around is I realized that lefty types have their own interpretation of this that's very different. Now, they like to point to the early 1980s, which of course is 10 years after this, and they like to point towards Ronald Reagan's inauguration. And so they take a lot of the same graphs, and I can include some links to some of these graphs. They include a lot of the same graphs, but instead of pointing to 1971, they point to, was that 1980 or so that Ronald Reagan would have been, or 1984 maybe. But and their interpretation is, oh, look, the issue isn't a lack of sound money. An issue is this hyper-conservative capitalism or whatever. Now, I think their narrative isn't very good, as any sort of consistent application of what free market capitalism looks like would not apply to the Reagan administration.
Right.
He actually did a lot of things that left-leaning people probably would like if they had been taught it in history. And so while I think that our gold standard type interpretation of what happened here is very good, it is worth paying attention to the fact that analysis of this type of history, analysis of this type of charts will always go through an ideological lens. And you have to be careful to make sure you're not just projecting what you want the interpretation to be versus what actually happened.
Yeah, totally agree. And let's focus on the 1971 one for a second, then we'll move on to 2012.
Yeah.
So I think my knee-jerk answer to a lot of these big macro trends is like it's complicated. Obviously, the world is multivariate. I don't think there's one specific explanation here. On the Reagan point, I often think that lefty pushback is just a little wrong insofar as, like, just empirically, because if you look at these charts, all of the trends start changing in 1971, 1972, right around in there. So I don't think their explanation has strong explanatory power, because they'd have to explain, like, well, these trends just continued in the early 1980s. They started before that, so you'd have to kind of explain that away.
Yeah.
So I think this is multivariate complicated. I think the gold standard is part of it. So when you remove the gold standard, there's now no inherent limit on the supply of money. There are some Austrian economists who argue that reducing or kind of taking the stopper off of the supply of money results in society as a whole having a lower time preference, because if your currency is going to inflate, meaning your individual dollar is going to lose value year over year, you therefore have an incentive to use it now rather than later, which would explain why the savings decreased and why time preferences as a whole kind of decreased. We have a trend toward consumerism as a result of that. So I think that's part of it for sure. But I have this heuristic in the back of my mind that I like to apply to things like this, which is that politics is downstream of culture.
Yeah.
And that the economy is in some senses downstream from culture as well. And I would point to the drastic cultural change that we had occur in the 1970s with the kind of hippie revolution, Woodstock, that had just happened in the 4 or 5 years prior, as a kind of a symbolic answer to that. My explanation of this is much more, yes, gold standard, that's part of it. If I had to apply, I'd say that's probably between 30 and 50% of the problem. But the other bulk of the problem, I think, is cultural.
Okay.
And I think what happened there is with the kind of hippie revolution, we lost the cultural focus on some things that were driving that income productivity growth. So one part of it, and let me be super clear here, I'm not making a normative statement about this. This is just a positive statement of fact. After that, one of the charts they included in there was how rapidly women entered the workforce around the 1970s and 1980s. And by definition, just basic economics, right? If you're doubling roughly, half the population now is entering the workforce, that by definition is going to put downward pressure on wages because there are more people competing for each individual job, which means there's more demand than there is supply for jobs, which means those jobs can afford to pay less because the subjective value of each individual job is a little lower. So I think that goes part of the way toward explaining, again, not fully, but at least part of the explanation of why real wages dropped and those kind of divorced. I also think from a cultural perspective, the financialization of the American economy took off in earnest in the 1970s and 1980s. As the gold standard ended, we had a lot of complex financial products start being born around then. The kind of derivatives markets were born later, admittedly, in the 1990s. You had some kind of wild bond traders and bond financial instruments that caused a mini recession in the 1980s. So I think increased financialization and access to easy consumer debt is a part of that. Credit cards became popular after the end of 1970s thanks to the removal of the gold standard, and people were spending more money again because their money's being inflated away in value. So I think the gold standard explanation there helps a lot. And then there's a final piece of this, which is a cultural shift that I want you to either challenge or maybe you can help me explain. And I think this is the other big part of it. For some reason, with that cultural revolution that happened in the 60s and 70s, I think this kind of ideology, this philosophy of instead of being optimistic as a society, we became more pessimistic. The ideology and kind of philosophy of safetyism, which is the idea that we should value safety effectively above economic growth. The egalitarian ideas from the hippie movement kind of bled into basically everything else. I think you can trace a pretty neat line to like the boomers who were experiencing in their teens and early 20s the hippie revolution and inculcated in those ideas. Then those people aged into and took over most institutions, and those people had left over from their hippie revolution this sense of egalitarianism, this sense of safetyism, this bent away from optimism and technological progress and focus on economic growth toward instead of growing the pie, divvying up the pie that we already have. You see one chart that's not in there, but that's important, is like the growth of federal regulations. While it had been growing a lot over time, the rate of growth drastically increases in the 1970s, which is going to stymie economic growth more. And I think finally the last piece of this, and again is also cultural, is the complexity to like live and operate in the world increased. So this is the last piece of this, for me at least. It became harder to like be productive and live in modern society because of how complex things got generally. There's some interesting little case studies on this about like the average IQ it takes to, for example, like navigate modern health insurance systems or navigate the home buying experience, etc. And if 50% of the population is below 100 IQ by definition, because the scale is mediated right there around 100, it's the perfect median average, then you end up with half the population that is going to do much worse economically because they quite literally cannot operate in a world as complex as ours. Like, to take a Kitsy kind of example, right? In the 1950s and 60s, you could get a high school diploma and just go get a job in one of the mega corporations at the time. There's a lot of corporate concentration at the time, like a GM or a GE or something, or go be a mechanic or whatever. And at that wage level, you could afford to raise a family of between 2 and 4 kids and at least have a modest house that you owned and could pay off, and a nice car that you could afford with a few months' wages and buy outright. So you can see how all these things kind of play in together. But I think the combination of all of those factors, which again, to reiterate, gold standard, women entering the workforce, the Cultural Revolution and the resulting kind of safetyism and egalitarianism, and the complexification of society as a whole, of which financialization is a part, you result in a world where economic growth is going to slow, which we see, wages are going to be depressed, which we see, and importantly, the income of the smartest people is going to drastically increase its rate of growth relative to those less fortunate, purely because society is more complicated. You have a stronger bifurcation in American society along IQ intelligence lines. So I think that basket of explanations pretty neatly describes the facts that we see: the wage stagnation, the income inequality increase, the decrease in energy consumption, the decrease in innovation. There's some of my favorite kind of economists have this idea called the Great Stagnation that says like since the 1970s our technological progress has stagnated, right? Like up to that point, you had every decade you had a life-changing technology. You had cars, you had the radio, you had television, you had refrigeration, you had air conditioning, and really all we've gotten in terms of life-changing you had the airplane and commercial air travel. All we've gotten since the 1970s is the internet. And I say all, that's massive, but it's operating in the world of bits and not the world of atoms. It has an impact on like lived experience of people, but less than some of those prior innovations. So maybe the low-hanging fruit have been picked. There's a few explanations of this, but I think my kind of hot take on this is it's a basket of problems that all kind of are intricately intertwined and synergistically combined to cause these problems. What do you think of that?
You know, it's obviously impossible to know. It's impossible to really know exactly everything that happened. And all those seem compelling. I might push back a little bit on the women entering workforce interpretation, because that would also mean women starting businesses. And there's some statistic that right now something like 60% of small businesses are started by women. Now, that includes things like they're selling things on Etsy and stuff like that.
Right.
But of course, if women are starting businesses, that means there's more jobs available, which the supply and demand. Yeah. So that's maybe the only thing I'd push back on. I also wonder about like the mindset of the boomer generation shifting from their parents' mindset of like, we're accumulating to invest for future generations. I'm going to buy this house so I can pass it on to my next children. Where like the boomers seem to have approached like accumulation from a consumer mindset of like, I just want all this stuff and I'm going to keep getting all this stuff. And I grew up with nothing, so I want everything. They buy the nice car, do the cocaine and get the new phone and everything. And it's not so much the mindset of like, I'm buying this stuff so I can pass it on to my children because it's going to be a value. It's more I'm buying all this stuff to consume it as a product. And my children are going to grow up in a world where their parents have a lot of stuff, but none of it is valuable, you know? If you grew up as a millennial in middle class, this is an experience I had, almost all my friends had. Your parents have a lot of stuff for some reason. They accumulated all these VCRs and everything and these books, but none of it is valuable. None of it is an investment that can shift over. Where their parents were thinking through the lens of, I'm going to buy land and I'm going to buy houses and I'm going to, build these kind of investments. Which I think might explain one reason why a lot of millennials and especially Gen Z has been attracted to like minimalism, as this kind of shift of like, okay, that consumerist perspective of accumulation wasn't helpful, so I'm going to still consume, but I'm going to do it from this very intentional kind of mindset. And also the economics of there's just things are more expensive, so of course you're going to consume less. It's so hard to reach any big, meaningful conclusions, but I think we're on the same page as far as this trend has happened. Objectively, economic conditions have gotten worse. Some things in the world have gone better. Murder's down, infant mortality's down, things like that. But a lot of measurable economic conditions have gotten worse over the past 50, 60 years. And it seems that cultural shifts as well as economic policy shifts are to blame for that. But beyond that, what sort of interpretations or conclusions I can reach are really challenging. I'm not too sure if I have much to say beyond that.
I agree. I think just throwing the flag up that like, hey, this is complicated and me and Gabriel are kind of guessing here is important. You guys should keep that in mind. But I think it's important for all of us to think about this because we got to figure out how to solve it, right? Like this is clearly a problem that needs solving. And in order to solve a problem, we need to know what caused it in the first place. I'll just add one point to that, and then let's move on to the 2012 article, which is I'm going to double down on your point about the boomer mindset of consuming versus investing for the future. Anecdotally, I have also seen the same thing. To your point, boomers have a lot of stuff. They take a lot of vacations, go on a lot of cruises, etc., whereas their parents were purely saving and investing for the future of their children.
Yes.
And the generation before them, the silent generation, that had just come out of a world war and therefore was very future-oriented. They were thinking like, all right, the world wars are over. We're the dominant power. Now it's time to try to make the world as good, as amazing of a place as is possible, and that's going to require investment beyond our generation. They were looking kind of beyond their generation to the more long-term future. And anecdotally, I've seen this. I was chatting with some friends literally yesterday that have young kids, and their parents are boomers. And even at that level, the boomers are kind of, like, for lack of a better term, to be honest, they're kind of selfish. They only want to like help with the kids when it's convenient for them, when it's fun for them. If it's hard or challenging or an inconvenient time for them, they don't want to do it. They're not willing to forego like one of their 3 vacations a year or their 2 cruises a year or whatever to help out with a thing kid specific, and this used to happen a lot, right? Like the whole extended family would help support the newlyweds, the young couple, as their earning potential is low at the time, because just by definition of being young. And you don't see that anywhere nearly as intensely. And then you also see it in housing prices, right? The part of the reason housing prices are so high is because these boomers, at every step of the way, because of the way the zoning and planning process works in the U.S., stop the construction of new housing and new stuff.
Yep.
Because they want to hold their property values as high as possible, and they don't care what the effects are on the next generation. They just want their property values to be high, so that they can profit from that if they decide to sell their house or do something else with it. So, yeah, I think this, anecdotally and at the meta level, I think the boomers are in part to blame here. There's just a genuine, very distinct boomer culture here. Let's move on a little bit. Spend the last 10 minutes or so here discussing the 2012 discontinuity. I'm leaving a little less time for this one because there's less going on there. All of these are kind of cultural. They're related to mental health primarily, and the kind of cultural stagnation around that. I have an explanation for at least part of this. I think the answer to the mental health crisis and the falling test scores and stuff could be explained in one word, which is the internet. I do think the smartphones and the kind of psychological, like dopaminergic system hacking that software creates. And again, this is coming from someone who co-founded a tech company, so like I'm not hating on the tech industry by any stretch of the imagination. That had to play a big part. I really do think again, reasoning from anecdote a little bit, but the anecdote is more to drive home this point that the internet has had a negative impact on children. There's one study I'll point to and then an anecdote. There's a great study. I'll see if I can find it and link in the description, that looked at the rollout of Facebook across the UK. So because of a quirk of UK telecommunications law, Facebook was not like universally available there at one time. It was rolled out by jurisdiction within the country. So you had a nice little what's called difference in differences research design, where you can just look at the mental health of the young people in a jurisdiction where it had not made it yet and compare that to the mental health of people in the jurisdiction where it had made it. And you see a sharp discontinuity. You see an increase in the areas that did get Facebook, in a bunch of mental health issues, depression, suicide, etc. So there's something almost intrinsic about social media for young people that increases these negative mental health outcomes, and it shortens their attention span. And we know this from some empirical literature. If they're exposed to a bunch of screen time early in life, like ages 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you see what's called social emotional regulatory issues, like how well they kind of have executive function controlling their emotions and interacting socially. You see attention span shortening. You see a drastic increase in ADHD diagnoses and symptoms. And I think almost all of that is the result of the internet, basically. Now, the part of this I don't have a good explanation for, to be honest, at all, is why the woke revolution sharply started in 2012. I don't know what happened in 2012 that could cause that, because those critical theorists had been in academic institutions for a few decades before that, and a lot of the publications that drive these ideas, the Foucault, the Marcuse, the Simone de Beauvoir, the Judith Butlers, right? Judith Butler in particular is responsible for some of the gender ideology stuff. That stuff was published in the 70s and 80s. So I have, and those people had been professors for a long time. I don't know why that one happened, and I also don't really have a good theory as to why culture stagnated in terms of originality of entertainment, right? Like, why are all movies remakes now? Why are all movies sequels now? Like, I genuinely do not have a good explanation for those two. I don't even have an idea.
Yeah, as far as the movie thing, I'm not too sure. It could be a function of capitalism. It could be a function of an economic function of the way like copyright has worked. Because I know there's an incentive for companies like Disney to remake so that they can maintain their copyright on certain things. So that could be an element of it. But as you were talking about social media and like cultural things like wokeness, and we're also seeing kind of a radicalization towards the right as well. There's definitely like polarization. I actually think it's impossible to talk about cultural shifts, especially of the generation you and I have lived through and future generations, without talking about specific social media sites. Tumblr and 4chan, I think, have had some of the biggest impacts on culture that we're only now kind of seeing, because they both, on opposite sides of this polarization, created these insular communities where people kind of had their bubble of politics. And so Tumblr, you can argue, has historically been more left-leaning. It had many of the kind of woke language that we've discovered, many of the identity terms for different sexualities and the flags, all the different flags, right? Every queer ideology has a different flag, or every queer identity has a different flag. Many of these didn't exist until Tumblr. They were like invented on Tumblr by small groups of maybe 20 or so people that invented these terms, and these terms then spread as the memetic sort of virus that they are. Where on the other hand, on 4chan, a lot of young men, usually white young men, were sort of infected with the memetic mind virus of what is now called the alt-right. They were exposed to like Holocaust denial. They were exposed to a culture of misogyny. They were exposed to an environment where people made dark, 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 dark jokes. And because you're on the internet, you can get away with it. And there's no social feedback for the dark humor, right? And so you kind of just think that's how it's supposed to be. And so you're a 12-year-old, and you either go in the direction of, I'm going to be an internet Nazi for a year, or go in the direction of, I'm going to be this hyper queer theory feminist who's inventing all these new terms for identity. And that 12-year-old, some of those ideas linger as they get older, and they spread it on to the next generation of 12-year-olds. And I think that's part of what happened here, was that specific social media sites created these insular bubbles of culture. And unique to any time in human history, these bubbles just kept growing and growing and growing, and kept being impactful, and kept compounding on and doubling down on their ideas, leading to these extreme versions of woke and the extreme kind of alt-right culture. I think that's a big part of what happened here.
I think you hit the nail on the head. I'm glad you brought this up. You reminded me of an internet historian and great kind of cultural commentator. I don't know if she's publicly released her real name or not, so I'll just say her username is Default Friend on Twitter. Her blog is, if you just Google Default Friend, you'll find it. Unfortunately, a lot of it's behind a paywall, but it's totally worth it. And she's a bit of an internet historian and has archived and discussed this as well. You just described her thesis exactly, which is that Tumblr and 4chan. I'll give a stylized version of the story. The stylized version is as follows. These ideas, a lot of them, had their academic intellectual roots in philosophers and thinkers in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. The young generation in the 90s and early 2000s were then getting into university, exposed to these ideas at a time when they had access to these echo chambers and could connect with other people that had these same ideological ideas from across the internet and only interact with those specific people instead of being exposed to contrary information on Tumblr and 4chan, respectively, for the two ideological camps you described, which is exactly right. And then, as that happened, when you get in an echo chamber, you get intensifying kind of ideological purification tests, which intensifies the in-group dynamics to encourage more and more extreme positions. What happens is, from a social signaling perspective, person A says something, person B says, "Oh, I want to signal that I am a stronger member of the group than that person, so I am going to claim a more extreme version of what person A said." And then after person B does that, person C repeats it, and this social signaling process causes a very rapid intensification. And then to your point, yeah, those people just aged out of Tumblr and 4chan and moved on into the world holding on to those ideas still. Like, they just took those forth into the world on Twitter, into HR departments, into more public academia, instead of just being kind of buried in kind of academic books very few people read. And it intensified from there. I think that is a very strong explanation for how this happened, because it's the first time in human history, to your point, ideological extremists from around the world were able to connect with one another and only one another in a kind of safe space, if you will, for them to ferment these ideas and grow them and then spread them throughout the culture as soon as kind of they aged out of those things. I mean, the greatest kind of anecdotal example of this is the meme going around in 2016 was that 4chan memed Donald Trump into the presidency, and they kind of did. A lot of the Trump memes, the more extreme stuff, the MAGA stuff, came straight out of 4chan intentionally. They thought it would be a really funny troll after Trump announced his presidency to throw their weight behind him. And a lot of the people on 4chan in particular are heinous people, as Gabriel described, but more importantly, very tech savvy. So they were able to make bots. A lot of the memes you're going to run into and meme templates are all born on 4chan. It's like some sort of weird alchemy of memes that come out of there. And they created the Donald subreddit and a bunch of kind of propaganda driven by bots on Facebook and Twitter and a few other locations. They memed him into the presidency. And you'll find 4chan threads kind of archived about this that are really fascinating, where they're like, once the election rolled around, he won the primary and then looked like he was going to win the presidency, or they were like, what did we do? Like, this wasn't intentional. Like, we were just joking, guys. Like, we didn't think this would actually work, and it did work. So that is my preferred theory as well, which only leaves us with the kind of remake problem. This idea that we're stuck in a permanent culture. Another example of this, there's a guy called Lindy Man. His name's Paul Scalise, but if you just look up Lindy Man, you'll find his blog. He's written about this a lot. And his take is basically that we've been stuck culturally for a few decades now. And one of his favorite examples of this is clothing, right? If you see a picture of people wearing specific clothing from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, you can instantaneously tell what decade it is from what they're wearing. However, if you look at people from the late 2000s to the entire 2010s era to now, it's very hard to tell because the clothing and everything has been the same. So his theory is that the internet, because it allows for extremely rapid mimetic spread, has somehow, some way, made us get stuck in this like permanent cycle of the same memes and ideas over and over again. And the internet feedback mechanisms have intensified this. So, for example, like if you try to make an original movie now, well, first of all, I think there is a capital component to that particular thing, which is movies have gotten much more expensive over time. The average movie cost is like over $100 million.
Yep.
So movie production companies, as a result, are much more risk averse. So they say, all right, what IP do we own that we know for sure will hit a home run? Well, it's superheroes. It's remaking stuff we've already done that we know will hit a home run. It's a much safer return on investment. And then with the internet, you could get brutally and viciously attacked by making something original that wasn't good. So you also increase the likelihood that like something original doesn't work very well. So his idea is that the internet has increased the mimetic transmission to such a high speed that it's stalled. Basically, we're just stuck spinning in a circle, more or less. So we'll have to link to that in the description as well.
Yeah.
Lindy Man's kind of explanation of this, but I think that's as close as we're going to get to a satisfying explanation. There's something it is not satisfying, but the gist of all of that, what happened in 2012, is like the internet. We're just now realizing what the internet did, and we don't really know what to do about it because we're not happy with a lot of the impacts. But and it has obviously enormous upsides, right? Like
Yep.
the mere fact that me and Gabriel can bring this information to you guys and do anything we're doing right now is because of the internet. So I still think the internet was an overwhelming net positive. Having said that, some of these cultural problems it created, we're still grappling with. We don't really know why they happened, and we don't really know what to do about them. So I find this whole idea really, really interesting, and I'll leave it with this. I'll ask you this question, and then I'll give an answer, Gabriel, and this can be it. Kind of what comes next. So I think we might be coming out of the other side of this because we finally have transformative technologies taking off again. Fusion energy is finally working, meaning there have been a few prototypes in the last 6 months in labs that produce more energy than they took to start, which was the fundamental problem with fusion. And remember, if fusion works, it is infinite clean energy. We basically have harnessed the power of the sun. There are several companies building hypersonic aircraft again, so we'll have actual technological progress in the physical world. There are a lot of flying car companies and VTOL, which stands for Vertical Takeoff and Landing Vehicle companies, that are coming out of the woodwork now. Space is a frontier that has reopened. SpaceX is sending more freight, more tonnage into orbit than every other nation state and company combined, and have plans to take us to Mars that are very realistic and I think could happen. So my kind of opinion is this has almost run its course. We also see a lot of the woke stuff is actually waning. Like cancel culture is almost dead. It's very hard to cancel people now. There was a guy that they tried to cancel 2 weeks ago with some very credible accusations of like when he was a teenager he wrote a bunch of heinous stuff online. Totally shrugged it off unscathed. I'm going to avoid kind of naming him to dive into that particular culture debate. I don't want to. My point is just objectively there was a cancellation attempt, and he did in fact say heinous things, and it failed. You see the Depp v. Heard trial, right, where in the height of the Me Too movement, Amber Heard made a bunch of Me Too-esque accusations. Johnny sued her for defamation and won. Yep. It was seen as a great cultural victory, kind of pulling back from the excesses of Me Too. If you look at the usage of woke words in media, they're decreasing now. So my hypothesis is also that, like, for reasons unknown to me, we seem to be like we might be coming out of the other side of this.
Yeah, there's always a pendulum swing. And every generation has something new to deal with and learns lessons from the previous generation and moves us forward. And so I'm pretty optimistic. I think human beings have a sense of progression, an overall trend towards progression. And while the internet did disrupt things, we're learning and we're figuring it out. And so I'm pretty optimistic. And I think that what we can do on individual levels is just like the kindness and genuineness that you give to people in person, learn how to do that online, learn how to not get stuck in the tribal kind of components, and learn to have empathy for people even when they're trolling you, and try not to troll back too much. And also, like, if you're frustrated by remakes, start pursuing the independent creators who are doing original stuff, and don't bash them for small mistakes. It is a very challenging thing to put your content out on the internet, because one little mistake and you have 100 trolls in your comments telling you that you're a piece of shit for one typo or something. And so I'm optimistic, and the solution here, man, is just be kind and be loving and be a human being, and do that online too.
Absolutely. Last thing I'll add to that, and then we'll break. I think it's also important to be authentic and to be sincere. A big part of the problem is that, like, people on the internet love to be irony pilled, they call it, right? Everybody is snarky, is cynical, rude, inauthentic online constantly, because any authenticity is just attacked vociferously. And I think another part of, besides just being kind, is also be authentic and be sincere. It is only through individual action, through each of us choosing actively to be authentic, to be sincere, to be open, to be kind, that we can continue to cause this change. And then a lot of stuff flows downstream from that. If we can correct the excesses of the negatives of the internet, man, the world is our oyster. I mean, the things we can do as a human society are amazing. I personally am a technological accelerationist, so I think AI is going to help a lot of this too. The next few decades are going to be very interesting as a bunch of sci-fi technologies all come online at once, like AI, like fusion, like hypersonic aircraft, like becoming an interplanetary species. And I think the cultural component gets fixed there too, Gabriel, which is like, and this is the last bit. I think as we start doing stuff again, that cultural nihilism turns into cultural optimism, which reinforces the growth and reinforces moving us out of this period of stagnation. So be optimistic, be kind, do things that matter in the world, and I think we can fix a lot of these problems. And with that, we will break. Thank you all so much for joining us. Again, subscribe, like this episode, comment and subscribe. It helps us more than you could possibly imagine with the algorithm. And if you're interested in this conversation and want to suggest other things to discuss in the future, or have some interesting thoughts to share yourself, then please join our Discord, which you can find links to in all of our social media, and on our mailing list. So go to learnarena.com, subscribe there, and sign up for our mailing list. And you can join our Discord that way. And we'd love to hear from you. Give us some feedback on these episodes and help us shape the future of the show. So with that, I will leave you all. I hope you all have a wonderful day.